Hello, everyone. Welcome to Next Generation Science Standards 101. This is part two of a multi-part series, and this is titled Digging into the Science and Engineering Practices. My name is Kirk Robbins. I am a science education consultant in the Puget Sound region of Washington State. If you haven't had a chance to watch Next Generation Science Standards 101 Part 1, which provides an overview, I would highly recommend that you do that before continuing on in this session. These online modules are intended to be for any K-12 teacher or for folks who support K-12 teachers. These modules have been designed specifically for a group of districts in the South Sound region of the Puget Sound area. You can see those districts on the screen. If you are a teacher and you are not from one of those districts, you're more than welcome to use this professional development, and we hope that you get a lot out of it. These online modules are funded by Washington State Laser through funding of the South Sound Laser Alliance. Many of the resources that we're using in these modules came from all around Washington State and outside of Washington State. Some of those are from the regional science coordinators in Washington State, and you can see the URL where you can reach your local regional science coordinator. There are a couple things you're going to want to do to get ready for this online session. First is you're probably going to want to have a partner. These sessions are designed to be done with small groups or with partners. Please do engage with all of the tasks. It's going to be a much richer experience for you if you actually do the readings, watch the videos, jot down a few thoughts when I ask you to. You might want to download the documents. There is a notebook or a handbook that you'll want to have downloaded to either jot down some thinking on paper or online in a Word document. Some of you might have been asked by your district to use the Google form, and the Google form and all of the links are off to the side on the screenshot here, so you should be able to see those on Brainshark. They're all linked. The Google form just allows your district to be able to get some evidence that you actually did participate and spent some time on this session. You're going to want to set aside about 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how many people are in your group and how much talking and thinking you do during the session. And as with the first one, please be prepared to pause the video, to watch some other videos, to do some readings, and then come back. Our agenda for this session is the following. We're going to spend some time just thinking about what does it mean to do science, and we're going to compare some of the different models that we've used for doing science in the past to the science and engineering practices. We'll spend some time really zooming into, so what are the science and engineering practices in the next generation science standards? And the way that we're going to engage with those practices, we're going to do three different things. First, we're going to watch a short video case of some real scientists and citizen scientists trying to figure something out, and we'll try to figure out which practices they're using. We're going to read a piece of text about some folks doing science and try to figure out which practices they're using. And then we'll zoom into a classroom and actually look at some kids using practices in a classroom setting. In the last session, things that we covered, we talked a little bit about the framework for K-12 science education and talked about the guiding principles that came from the framework. We looked at a little half sheet, a cheat sheet of the next generation science standards, and that might be a useful thing for you to have for this session too, because we'll be focusing on the top of that sheet, the things that are in the blue text box. And we also launched this idea that what's different about the next generation science standards is the integration of those three dimensions, so that in the next gen science standards, every performance expectation has kids using a practice, what they know about a disciplinary core idea, and a cross-cutting concept to make sense of something. So that's the innovation in the next generation science standards. Today, we're going to be zooming in on just one of those three dimensions, the science and engineering practices. As we talked about in the last module, the big innovation in the next generation science standards is the integration of the three dimensions that are laid out in the framework. So taking the science and engineering practices, the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts and creating performance expectations that have a little piece of each of those, that's the innovation. The three dimensions aren't really new things. It's making sure that we're having kids think about and use all three of those dimensions in the classroom. That's the innovation. In the past, we've had ways in K-12 education to marginalize the practices and to marginalize the cross-cutting concepts and to mostly focus on disciplinary core ideas, or what we've called content. So the next generation science standards are really going to help us to keep the science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts visible for students to use as they're learning science. So in this session, we're going to be spending some time thinking about the science and engineering practices, which is really how do scientists and engineers actually do their work. So on page 2 in your packet, I want you to take about 3 minutes and think about this probe. So this is our ideas about doing science, and you'll see that there are 5 teachers learning about the next generation science standards, and each of them is sharing how they think we do science and engineering. So what I would like you to do is put a check by the teacher that you agree with, and then put a check by the teacher that you think most of your students might agree with. So take a few minutes, pause the video, and think about this probe. So you've had a chance to think a little bit about what it means to do science, and you can see from that probe that we might have lots of different ideas about what it means to do science. What we're going to do next is we're going to watch a video called How Science Works, and this is from the California Academy of Sciences, and this is the story of the discovery of a new species of spider in the state of Oregon a few months ago. As you watch the video, you're going to notice that they show a very complex model that they use for how we do science. Please don't take notes or try to memorize that model, but do notice how it might be different than models that we've used in the past for teaching students about how we do science. The video should be in the links off to the right-hand side of this video in BrainShark, and it's titled How Science Works. So take a few minutes to watch that video and then come back. After doing the Doing Science probe and watching the How Science Works video, some of us may be feeling a little bit like, so are the next generation science standards not built around inquiry? Are we not supposed to be teaching the scientific method? If those are some of the questions that you have, I've put a link to an optional reading. It's from the University of Washington on a website that they just started a few months ago called STEM Teaching Tools. And the title of this reading is Why Focus on Science and Engineering Practices and Not Inquiry? Why is the scientific method mistaken? So in order to really fully embrace the science and engineering practices, we're going to need to step away from what we've called inquiry in the past, and we're going to need to step away from what we've called the scientific method and really just jump headfirst into the science and engineering practices. And that's what the rest of this session is about. So how do we understand what those science and engineering practices really are, and what might be some barriers to us engaging students in those practices? So the framework for K-12 science education and the next generation science standards really clarify what we've called inquiry in the past by using the 8 science and engineering practices. So if it's easier for us to perhaps think that this is our new inquiry or this is our new scientific method, then that might be a helpful way to think about it. With the caveat that this is not a method, and even though these practices are numbered 1 through 8, that should not imply that we just march through them from 1 to 8. There are several places where we might enter this, and different ways that we can bundle these practices together as we're trying to explain something or trying to solve a problem. So these 8 science and engineering practices are what we're going to be hovering over for the rest of this session. These are always marked in blue in the next generation science standards, and it's the same 8 practices for a kindergarten student as it is for a senior in high school. Now they're going to look different, and there's a progression of how the different students might use them at different grade bands, but it's still the same 8 practices. On page 3 in your packet, there is a handout that we're going to be using for most of this session. And as you can see, it lists the 8 science and engineering practices, and one of the columns just to the right of those practices asks you to jot down, what do you think this practice is mostly about? So that should just be a word or a short phrase. So for example, for practice 3 about planning and carrying out investigations, you might jot down, well, I think this is mostly about experiments. So that might be an example of kind of an initial reaction. So take a couple minutes and jot down what comes to mind when you just read the titles of the 8 science and engineering practices. So what we're going to do next with page 3, you had a chance to jot down your ideas about each of the 8 science and engineering practices. Hopefully you talked with a partner or with your group about what you think each of those means. What we're going to do next is we're going to watch another video. This is the story about some citizen scientists and scientists trying to figure out what was happening with sea stars off the coast of Washington and Oregon during the summer of 2014, so just recently, and this was called sea star wasting syndrome. So as you leave this site to watch the video on sea star wasting syndrome, on page 3, I want you to jot down where are some places in the video that the scientists and citizen scientists are using the science and engineering practices. So you just finished watching the PBS video on sea star wasting syndrome, and what we're going to do now is we're going to use that as a case to think about the 8 science and engineering practices. So I have watched this video many times with hundreds of teachers now, so I'm just going to share some of the things that teachers have shared with me as they've been thinking about the 8 science and engineering practices and this video. So we're going to go through each of the practices one by one quickly. So for practice 1, asking questions in science and defining problems in engineering, you'll notice that this is one of the practices where it's kind of 2 practices in one. We have this idea that scientists ask questions and that engineers are trying to define problems. So in the video, the key question that keeps coming up is what's killing the sea stars? What is happening to the sea stars? And which might lead to us trying to solve a problem or define a problem, which is how might we help the sea stars if we could figure out what's happening. Some other things to note about this practice is that even though it says asking questions in science and defining problems in engineering, engineers also ask questions, right? So they're asking lots of questions as they're designing solutions. That's not something that's only in the domain of doing science. Another interesting thing about practice 1 is that students, as they're engaging in the practices, will ask questions within all of the other 7 practices. So for example, as they're developing and building models, they're going to have questions about those models. As they're getting ready to plan and carry out investigations, they're going to be asking questions about the best way to do this investigation, or what type of evidence are we trying to collect. They're going to have questions about how to construct the best explanation. So questioning, even though it's listed as a discrete practice, is more than just the investigative question in a lab. We want kids to be asking lots of questions as they engage in all of the practices. For practice number 2, developing and using models, some places where you may have seen that in the video, you may have talked about that where they show the map. That might be a type of model that's being built. The use of the hashtag 6sea star might be a way where they're building a model of the actual infection and what's happening with the sea stars. One of the main takeaways about practice 2, developing and using models, is that we're not just talking about physical models. We're talking about diagrams, drawings, mathematical models, conceptual models, mental models. So we're not just talking about kids building a model, but it's probably usually a diagram or a drawing of how they think of something working. And we're really usually talking about an explanatory model, using a model to explain how something in science or engineering works. For practice number 3, planning and carrying out investigations, in the video, some places where you may have felt like this practice was happening were when the diver was observing sea stars, when the scientists were observing sea stars. That is a type of investigation. And then they were also talking about the infectiousness experiments that they set up where they put sick sea stars together with what seemed to be healthy sea stars. Some other things to think about in terms of what does this practice mean is that when we're planning and carrying out investigations, that actually will include elements from lots of other practices within that. Another thing to make sure that we're thinking about is that planning and carrying out investigations, that's more than just controlled experiments. That might be field studies, and a lot of times it's just making observations of the natural world. For practice number 4, analyzing and interpreting data, some spots where that may have been happening in the video, where the scientists and citizen scientists were trying to make sense of their experiments and observations. Some other notes, things for us to think about with this practice is that when we say data, we're not just talking about numbers. These can be observations or pictures or drawings. And another thing for us to think about is that as much as possible, we really want to get kids using digital tools whenever that makes sense or that it's feasible. We want kids to have some powerful tools for helping them make sense of the data that they're collecting. Practice number 5 is about using mathematical and computational thinking. In terms of the video, there aren't necessarily a lot of places where that's clearly evident, but we can infer that there's lots of mathematical and computational thinking that's happening in the background. I've had some teachers who have said that hashtag sick starfish is one place where we're trying to use some math and computational thinking. A couple other notes to think about this practice are that occasionally we want to let students decide what type of data they're collecting. So do they need qualitative data? Do they need quantitative data? Letting them make some of those decisions about what they're going to collect. And then this connects also with practice 4 when we're talking about letting kids use some digital tools in terms of the math and computational thinking that they're using. Practice number 6, constructing explanations and designing solutions. If you notice, this has a very similar construction to practice 1, where it's almost 2 practices in one. We have that scientists are constructing explanations and that engineers are designing solutions. So this is a very important practice. Several people I work with have talked about that if you really focus on this practice in your science and engineering instruction, that's going to pull along most of the other practices. So in other words, if our focus is to have kids explain some phenomena or answer a question, that they're going to need to use most of the other practices in order to do that. So in the video about sea star wasting syndrome, some places where practice 6 is happening. Well, there are lots of tentative claims. The scientists and citizen scientists are trying to figure out what's going on. So they have these tentative claims and some emerging evidence that they're using to construct an explanation. What's really great about this video is that it shows that tentativeness, it shows that act of constructing an explanation. A lot of times students don't see that. They think of science as a body of knowledge, all of these things that have been figured out. So a big part of the science and engineering practices is to help kids to see what it means to be an evidence-based thinker and to immerse them in that. Some other notes on this practice is that constructing explanations has great connections with Common Core, ELA standards, and just good evidence-based thinking. Practice 7 is engaging in argument from evidence. Some places in the video where that might be happening, I've had some folks tell me that maybe the whole video is essentially engaging in argument. So just the act of trying to identify what is causing sea star wasting syndrome, it's a story of engaging in argument, trying to figure out what does the data seem to be telling us, what evidence do we have, what are some claims that we can make, and which seems to be the correct claim. Some notes about engaging in argument from evidence. This is really, these are the skills and ways of thinking and habits of mind that we're using to identify what is the best explanation and what are some of the best solutions to a problem. Argumentation like practice number one, asking questions, tends to happen in many or most of the practices. So even though it's a discrete practice, it tends to run through all of the practices. So for example, when we're building a model, we might engage in some argument about something that might be missing from the model or how a model might be improved. So that's a key thing to remember about practice 7, engaging in argument. So our final practice is practice 8, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. In the video, I've had folks say that there are just layers of this practice happening in the video. The video is a way of communicating with us, with the public. It's a story of scientists and citizen scientists obtaining lots of information, evaluating that information, and communicating with each other as a group. So there are really layers of this happening. An interesting note about practice number 8 is that they did a survey within the last couple of years where they interviewed real scientists and engineers about how often they use each of the 8 practices. And what was uncovered was that real scientists and engineers spend over half their time engaged in practice 8. So reading, writing, sending emails, poster sessions, talking on the phone, all of those types of things would be in practice number 8, and real scientists and engineers spend a lot of their time doing that. So thinking about in our classrooms, how do we engage students intentionally in this, in practice 8, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information? So we've used a video case on C-star wasting syndrome to think about the 8 science and engineering practices. What we're going to do now is we're going to read a piece of text that's in your packet. And this is an article from the New York Times from about a year ago. And it has a real catchy title. It says, by 2047, coldest years may be warmer than hottest in past, scientists say. So think a little bit about what that is saying to us. So what I want you to do is take about 5 to 7 minutes. You're going to skim over this article, and as you're reading, jot down in the margins which practice seems to be happening in the given sentences and paragraphs. So what I would do is just label the practices with numbers. So for example, if someone's asking a question or defining a problem, I would put a number 1 for practice 1. So take a few minutes, read the article, and jot down which of the 8 science and engineering practices seem to be at play in the article. So you've had a chance to read this article from the New York Times. And my question for you is really, which practices seem to just jump out at you that were just very apparent? When I ask that question to folks in face-to-face professional development sessions, these are some things that they tend to talk about. So that practice number 2, developing and using models, right? In this text, it's really the story of these computer models, these mathematical models about climate. So what you'll notice is that practice 2 is very apparent, but then practice 2 just automatically pulls along practices 4 and 5. So analyzing and interpreting data and using mathematical and computational thinking. Because they're mathematical models, those 3 practices just get bundled together. Another part that many folks will talk about is argumentation, that there are several places in here that the scientists are arguing for a different way of thinking about the models or a way that they applied the models. So there are probably other practices that you jotted down and that you talked about with your partner, but those are 4 that I've had people really say kind of bubble to the top in this article. And of course, practice 8, communicating, evaluating, obtaining information, because like the video clip on C-star wasting syndrome, it has layers of that practice. This is a paper about a paper that was published in Nature, so it's communicating with us and telling the story of the scientists who used this model and how they figured it out. So far in this session, we've really looked at 2 different cases of real science happening, the C-star wasting syndrome and then the climate models, the article from the New York Times. So what we're going to do next is zoom into the classroom. So what do the science and engineering practices start to look like when they're implemented in a classroom? So you're going to be watching a video in a few seconds. This is a third grade classroom. The question that these third graders are thinking about is, do very tiny things have weight? And they've conducted some investigations and observations. They've looked at different cubes that are the same size and noticed that the pine cube seemed to have a certain amount of weight, and the copper cube, even though it was the same size, seemed to have a different amount of weight. They've taken little shavings of clay and dropped them on the hand of somebody with their eyes closed, and their partner, if they can feel that tiny piece of clay, would open their hands. So what we're going to be zooming in on in this clip is these third graders are circled up. They have their science notebooks and some thinking recorded in those notebooks in front of them, and the teacher just starts by asking them the question, do very tiny things have weight? On page 7 in your packet, there is a place to take some notes. So you might want to jot down some notes about what the teacher is doing and saying, what the students are doing and saying, and what are the practices that the kids seem to be using. Now, unlike the article in the video case, we're probably not going to see all of the practices, but I think we're going to see more than one at use in this clip. So you've had a chance to watch the video of the third grade students thinking about the question, do very tiny things have weight? And our mission was to jot down which practices seem to be in use by these third graders. And some things that I've had folks talk about in the past were questioning, that there were questions being asked by the teacher and by some of the kids. Argumentation was happening. The kids are using some evidence to support claims, and they're not all agreeing, so they're doing some respectful disagreeing at times. They're in the act of constructing explanations. They are trying to answer this question, do very tiny things have weight? So that's one of the practices they're engaged in, is just answering that question. They're maybe analyzing and interpreting some data. They've gathered some different observations and done some different things. They're trying to make sense of those and what those observations mean. And then there's some communicating happening, right? They're sharing information with each other, with the teacher, and trying to make sense of this idea, do very tiny things have weight? So let's talk a little bit about some take-home messages from this session on the science and engineering practices. What are the things that I'm hoping that we all walk away with? So the first one is that the science and engineering practices are not just the scientific method with different words attached to it. Really very different. Science and engineering practices are very authentic, very flexible, and probably a little more messy than the scientific method. So that might be one new piece of learning for some of us, and something that we might wrestle with a little bit. Another take-home message is that the science and engineering practices are for the students. There are a lot of these practices that we as teachers have been using for a long time. Teachers have been building models and teachers have been constructing explanations, but now we really want to flip that. We want the students to be developing and using models. We want the students to be constructing their own explanations. And one of the repercussions of that is that students are going to be wrong sometimes. So we need to be prepared for that. What type of a classroom do we need to have where it's okay for students to be wrong when they're sharing their ideas? And then as teachers, what pieces of evidence and information do we give them so that by the end of a unit, they're right? Another take-home message is that the science and engineering practices don't happen in a particular order. So they're numbered on the documents that we've been looking at, but that doesn't mean that you just start with practice 1 about asking questions and march through them. The science and engineering practices will require students to talk and make their ideas public. So that sounds a lot different than the science classrooms that I grew up as a learner participating in. So kids are going to be talking about their ideas. They're going to be making those ideas public on poster paper or whiteboards. So what type of classroom environment do we need to have to help that to happen? And then the last one is really a question for us. So where can we get our students engaged in the science and engineering practices in our current units of study? So just whatever unit you're currently working on, how can you focus on that same content part, but then have this new content, which is the science and engineering practice? Maybe it's on modeling, maybe it's on argumentation. So we are winding down to the end of this online module. Hopefully you have a much better sense of the 8 science and engineering practices by watching the video about sea-star wasting syndrome and reading the article from the New York Times. I'm hoping that you can see that the 8 science and engineering practices are authentic practices that real scientists and engineers use. And then by watching the video of the 3rd grade class, we can zoom in and see that these are practices that when students use them and engage in these practices, that we'll need to support their thinking. We're going to need to create an environment that's very safe for them to share ideas and to be wrong. And that there might be some shifts in the way that we've taught science in the past to how we might teach it now to support the next generation science standards. So on page 8 in your packet, there are 3 questions that I want you to think about. If your district is asking you to use the Google form, then please do complete these questions in the Google form as well. So thank you so much for taking some time to attend this session. Our next session will be Next Generation Science Standards 101 Part 3, called Uncovering the Cross-Cutting Concepts. So we will take some time similarly to what we did in this session, but switching over to the green section, the 7 cross-cutting concepts. Thank you so much.